Hello everybody, my name's Ian Thomas. I spend a lot of time working on game narrative, thinking about story structure for computer games, working out how to get players into a certain state of mind for a game, looking at backstory, world, all of those sorts of things. I, in my career, have also spent a lot of time working on game mechanics. I was a programmer and still am a programmer, but I used to work on the verbs of gameplay, so gameplay systems, running, jumping, for things like the Lego games. I have, over years, done a lot of live events, interactive theatre, lots of LARP for probably about 30 years now, slightly disturbingly. And I write things, books, TV scripts, film scripts, a children's picture book about Cthulhu, for example, and RPG systems. And I wear many hats. Myself and my partner Rachel run a LARP organisation called Crooked House, based in the UK. You might have heard something about it this weekend at one of our other talks. We jointly run a company called Story Worlds, which we use for publishing books and the like. I set up a company called Tailspinners with a colleague about 6 years back, which concentrates on writing game story as an outsourced company. It's now a cooperative of a whole lot of people all working together internationally. And I took a back seat from that a bit this year because I became the narrative director at Ubisoft in Stockholm, working on something that I can't talk about yet. So what is this talk about? How can you put horror in your game? I'm not actually going to talk about that for a very good reason, because if you take only one thing away from this talk, remember that you're not trying to put horror into your game, you're trying to put it into the mind of your player or your players, and you're trying to make your players do the work of terrifying themselves. And a lot of the principles I'm going to talk about today are things that specifically apply to horror because it's very easy to talk about, but you can use very similar principles to spark other emotions in people. It's just a bit harder and a bit harder to understand. I'm going to refer to a couple of games a few times during this talk because they make good examples. The first one is the computer game Soma, which I worked on as a level designer and scripter and programmer and helped out with editing and things. It is an existential horror set at the bottom of the ocean and was produced by Frictional Games, I think probably 5-6 years ago. And then the second thing I'm going to talk about is a LARP event called God Rest Ye Merry, which myself and my partner Rachel and a bunch of other people under the banner of Crooked House ran in 2015. It was a Christmas ghost story set in the 1950s. Where should we start? With this, it's all in your mind. The brain makes things up. The human brain is designed for fight or flight. It's designed to spot threats and react to threats at a deeply physiological level. It's something which is very hard for us to control. And if we can wire directly into that system, we can make things happen for the player that they don't expect and can't back away from. It's why we jump at shadows. Jump scares, while they're very cheap in games, in horror movies, they are often really, really effective. And you can build those up and make a lot of those. But my preference is for more long-term, deep-rooted horror. Brains build patterns. They're amazing pattern building machines. They build patterns out of things which just aren't there. They take disparate things, connect them together, tell themselves a little story and come to a conclusion. Often that conclusion is 2 + 2 = 5 because we go for the worst case scenario because our brains are worried for us and they want to keep us safe. A good example of this is something called pareidolia, which I'm probably pronouncing wrongly, but is the tendency of people to see faces. We're wired to interpret expressions, and so we see them where they aren't. We're very, very good at this sort of storytelling, even when it's really not in our favour. We're also very, very good at lying to ourselves. A good example of this might be the game Alien Isolation. Say, for example, there is a vent pipe. There are always vents in these sort of games. There's a vent pipe along the ceiling of the room you're currently standing in. You hear a noise scratching at one end of the vent pipe. And then a few minutes later, you hear a noise in the middle of the vent pipe. And then you hear a noise at the end, just where the cover into the vent pipe is, and the cover opens and the alien drops down and unfolds in front of you. Now, obviously none of this is really happening because These are all pixels in a computer game, right? But we're also constructing a story out of the stimuli we're being given. The sounds are probably placed by a sound designer. There's probably not an alien making noises in that pipe, not a full animation, nothing like that. There's just a little sound playing, then another little sound playing, then a third sound playing, and we're constructing a little story in our heads about a creature inside the pipe moving along. We're using our mind's eye to see that thing, to worry about that thing, and so when it drops down, we're anticipating it. But all we're really doing is stitching a separate set of stimuli together and telling ourselves a story. The brain is amazing at filling in these details and imagining things they can't see. Another good example from God Rest You Merry, the LARP game that I was talking about, we had somebody lying in bed late at night. They were trying to sleep. There was somebody else in the room with them. It was dark, and they woke up to fire coming in underneath the door and around the door. They could hear the crackle of it, they could smell the smoke, they could see the flames under the doorway, and then the door burst open and into the room came smoke, but also this ghost. It floated towards her as she lay in the bed, it turned its head towards her, it grinned at her, and then it disappeared back out of the door again. Now, that's the story which she told to us. The flames and the smoke, they were faked by us. We had put in projections, we'd put in smoke, we put in scents, all of that sort of thing. The creature itself was a puppet, which we pushed into the room on a pole. Now, it didn't have an animated face. It couldn't turn its head, its neck was fixed. It couldn't grin at her, but the story she tells is of it turning to look at her, grinning at her, before it pulled out again. And this is the brain overactively adding in all these details, maybe only seeing things in the half light, and maybe even it's something she didn't see at the time and then she built in her head after the event. But whatever it is, the human brain is great at filling in stories and putting in details. Here's another example. This is from the game Soma. This is a short sequence from the game. Just to set the scene a little, Simon, our protagonist, has got to the bottom of the sea. He's looking for a particular person, Catherine, and he's just heading into an underwater base to see if he can find her.
This must be Lambda, where Catherine is.
Catherine?
Be quiet! Don't look at it!
What did we see? Well, the interesting thing right at the beginning, which is a heavy metal door, which takes a while to open, which is interesting because you start to think about the weight of water, and once you're in there and it closes behind you, you realise how long it's going to take before you can open it again and escape. So nice little psychological thing. But what we actually saw was Simon heading through the base, encountering a creature, turning, running and hiding behind a pile of boxes while that creature paced around him. Except that isn't actually what we saw. Again, throwing away the idea that this is all pixels in the first place. If you noticed, the player spent the time crouching behind the pile of boxes and didn't look at what was following it. And we deliberately have a line in there, don't look. And so what was actually pacing around the player was a series of positional sounds based in 3D they could hear in their headphones, and a mental image of where the creature was and what it might look like. They never really looked at the creature directly. There was just this formless impression of this thing moving around them. And I can guarantee you that the thing in their heads was far, far scarier than the 3D model that they didn't actually see. In this sort of game, if you actually see some of these 3D models out there in full light doing their normal animations, you're going to be kind of disappointed. It's going to be a bit of a letdown. The fear isn't going to be there. The monster in your head is always way, way scarier. This is why Alien works much better than Aliens as a horror movie. Alien is a horror movie, Aliens is an action movie. In Alien, you barely glimpse the thing. The smoke, everything is obscuring what you're seeing. You get flashes of this creature, and that's enough. It's the same with Jaws. Alien being Jaws in space. Jaws wouldn't have worked anything like as well if the rubber model had worked, which it didn't. So it's hardly in any shots because their model broke. And that meant for a much, much more effective film. So a thing to note in all this is that the player isn't playing the game that they see, they're playing their own mental model of the game. They're building a picture in their head of what the game is, how it works, and what its rules are. And that can lead to problems if you've communicated that model badly and if the game starts doing things that it doesn't expect. Or it can break down when they start to realise that the model is far simpler than they thought. Another good example, if you're hiding from a monster in a tunnel and it's walking around and you start to realise that it's walking the same pattern again and again, the same pathway, and it's a patrolling thing, then you go, okay, this isn't a scary creature, this is a piece of AI and a puzzle that I have to get past in the game, rather than treating it as a scary monster. So trying not to expose those sort of patterns is really important in this kind of horror. A lot of what I'm talking about here is about sketching things out and leaving gaps for the player to fill in with their own imagination. It's all about trying to get the player to do the work here. Jaws, Alien, the Jiangshi we just saw, all of those things. If we're very certain about what's going on, if we're not using our own imagination, if it's just being presented to us on a plate, a lot of the engagement and a lot of the horror and a lot of the emotion is gone. Let's go a bit deeper into gaps. There's a book by Scott McCloud, who's a comics author, called Understanding Comics, and I very strongly recommend you have a read of it. It's got all sorts of things which apply to all sorts of genres. He talks about the gaps between comic panels, where it's left to the reader's imagination as to what happens in that gap. So what we see here, for example, is somebody bringing an axe down towards somebody, and then we cut, and you just hear the scream. That's what's going on visually in this panel here. And we're leaving it to the reader's imagination as to what happens in that gap. And I'm sure you've seen that sort of idea in films as well. And it can often be much more effective to imagine that sort of thing. And by imagining it, visualize the situation and put yourself potentially in that situation than it is to see it all laid out in front of you. It's much more effective that way. And also you can get away with ratings as well. Fail Better Games, the company that produced Fallen London, Sunless Seas, Sunless Skies and similar games, have this concept that they call fires in the desert. The stories that they tell have lots of little gaps in them. So perhaps you get invited to meet the Duchess, and then later on you actually meet the Duchess. But in the meantime you could have done almost anything, and it's entirely up to the player to decide how they got from the invitation to actually meeting the Duchess. You don't describe getting in the coach, you don't describe what time of day it happens, anything like that. It's very, very loosely sketched out, and the little piece of story you get is quite dense and detailed, but then the gaps between them, it's up to you, and it's up to you how your character feels about things. Another good example, if I describe the fact that there is a boy sitting on a step outside a house playing with a ball, then anybody listening to this will have a different idea of what the house looks like, what the step looks like, what colour the ball is. And that's all of you bringing your imagination and your creativity to something I've just sketched out. And that's really pretty interactive. This is something we saw more often in old style games. Text games are really, really good at this. You can summon up 1,000 orcs in a line. in games which had much more rudimentary graphics than the photorealistic stuff we got now, there is a tendency to decorate that graphics in our mind, to build things up, create personas, create characters that just weren't there. If you go back to a game that you loved as a kid, it's probably way less detailed than the memory of the game that's in your head. This makes these things really interactive. It gives space for the player to play. Another good example is starting writers often over-describe things. So a writer will write something like he was 6'3", he had a scar on his chin, piercing green eyes, all of those sort of details. Whereas I'm not sure I even know the colour of the eyes of my best friends, because I've never really paid attention to that. I pay attention to the space they take up in a room, maybe, and the impact they have on people and the way that they talk. But exact details, unless you've got a good reason in a story to be paying absolute attention to that, you probably won't notice it. I much prefer descriptions from things like, for example, Agatha Christie has a good line. She was the sort of woman who wore limp dresses. Now that summons up a particular type of character, but probably a totally different appearance of character in, again, anybody who's reading that. Similar great description from Raymond Chandler. She was a dame, the sort of dame to make a bishop kick a hole in a stained glass window. What does that mean? We don't know. But the images that are summoned up by these things are personal and unique to the reader, the player, the viewer, whatever it is. And that means that these things are very interactive. It also, I think, is why everybody argues when a well-loved book is turned into a film, because everybody will have their own ideas of what the characters look like and how they behave and how they move. As soon as you see photographs of actors on screen, they probably don't match your mental model, and so you'll be a little bit disappointed by it. Another reason we can use these gaps is to bind in the player and the character to create empathy between the two. An awful lot of my work particularly is to try and make the player and the character feel like the same person, because then you can do things to the character which directly affect the player, rather than the player kind of watching it at a distance. For example, in Soma, Simon is very much a blank slate in Soma, deliberately so, because we're trying to make it so that the player and the character feel like the same thing. When we were beta testing the game, there are a lot of occasions where Simon would spot something in the environment and would remark on it, for example. And we might want to do that because we're trying to draw the player to look at a particular thing. But there would be a number of times where Simon would spot something maybe before the player did, or would spot it and the player would never spot it. And so Simon would say something like, "What's that over there?" And the player would be already spinning the camera around going, "What? Where? I don't see anything." And suddenly you've got a separation between the two, and that's not helpful for us. So we removed a lot of those lines, and the blending between the player and the character became a lot better. Another example would be the character generation system that we used for our 1950s LARP, God Rest You Merry. So we'd been to a few events where we'd been given fully briefed characters before we went to these games. We'd be given, I think the worst excess was like 43 pages of character background that I got given before I had to go and play a character that I was paying to play in somebody else's game, and it's really difficult to remember all that, and it gives you fear that you're not doing what the writers want you to do, if you've forgotten your motives, if you've forgotten this tiny piece of history, and it's not your character, you're acting for somebody else. What we did for God Rest You Merry is we had a really simple system where we said to the player, what sort of thing do you want to play? Do you want it to be more physically based, mentally based, socially based? Do you want to mix those things up a bit? And then once we'd had their response, we wrote back a one-liner or two-liners to them, saying something like, you could be a vicar with a dark secret, something happened to his wife 20 years ago, or how about a market gardener who had an illegitimate child and gave that child up very young? Basic, simple things like that. Then when we were coming up to the event, each person received a player pack, which was full of stuff. This sort of stuff, documents, maps, a national identity card which would say who they were and when they were born, magazines which might feature articles about them or their relatives, letters that would link them to other people in the game. And hopefully, I mean, this is slightly less daunting than the 43 pages of A4 because it's a delight to open this sort of stuff, I would hope. But in amongst these things, you find a lattice of facts. Things like you gave up your illegitimate daughter for adoption. Now, the fact would be in here, the adoption papers, those sort of things. But what we wouldn't say is what you felt about it. and why exactly you had done it. And we'd leave a lot of these gaps in there so that you could fill out the details and make the character your own. And the important things for us to get in here were things like secrets and relationships to other characters. You knew who your brother was, you knew who your father was, those sort of things. But the rest of it was up to you. The other nice thing about presenting characters like this is you take these materials with you to the game, because then you can refer to them if you've forgotten something or something like that. But also, there's some good blackmail material in these packs, and that creates game and that creates play. So one of the things that we're doing here is removing friction between the player and the character and trying to make it so that you are the character and the character is you. Because as I said, if you then affect the character emotionally, hopefully you're affecting the player emotionally. It at least makes it much more likely that's going to happen. And that's why first person is a really good viewpoint for horror games, because we're not seeing a character and seeing things happen to the character. The things are happening to you. And you can do little subtle things to make this better. For example, in the frictional games, rather than pressing a button to open a door, you grasp with your hand, pull on the door and pull it open, and it makes it much more physically based. They do that for drawers and chests and things that they're picking up and all these sort of things. It roots you more in the world. You feel like you are part of the world, and it feels like it's a struggle to move things around. It feels like, for example, that if you have to close this door again being chased by a monster, it's going to be hard. It's not just going to be a case of hitting the right button on the controller at the right time. You feel like an inhabitant of the world. And this applies very much to things like game controls. An example of this, a lot of people don't really rate the work of David Cage, Beyond Two Souls, Heavy Rain, all of those sort of things. And Lord knows the games have problems, but there are one or two flashes of really interesting stuff that come through in things like the controller scheme. So the controller scheme for Quantic Dreams games are often quite weird. They're often using the controller in a way that you wouldn't expect, and that often gets in the way and you have to stop and think about it. However, there's a good example, I can't honestly remember whether it's Heavy Rain or Beyond Two Souls right now, where you're trying to get your character through an electric fence, and you press one button to lift one leg and put it through, and another button to put the other leg through. So you're holding those two buttons down, and then a third one to duck down and get your head under it, and a fourth one. And what's really interesting is your hands are contorting almost into claws as you're doing this, and you can feel the tension through your hands, and it's mirroring the tension that's in the game, which is fascinating, and one of the few times where I felt their control system really, really worked, because you're managing to make something physical happen in the player that's reinforcing the emotion you're trying to make happen in the game at that point. And there's lots of feedback loops you can use for all of this sort of stuff. I mean, obviously, visuals and audios, the rumble in game controllers, you can use in really subtle ways, sometimes that the player doesn't even notice, that will make their physical body react to things. There is another part of this as well, which is about trying to get the controller out of the way of the player, which is a thing that Quantic Dream often fail at. Ideally, if the player has an intention to do something, for example, jump, they shouldn't have to think about how, they should just jump. So they should be so used to the controller that they don't even think about pressing the button. In their head they think jump, then they jump. They don't really know how that happens. If you have to stop and think about the controls, you've thrown them out of the immersion, you've thrown them out of the illusion, and suddenly they're playing a game again. Particularly if they're trying to do something and they find it frustrating to do. That is a real breakdown of communication. Ideally, what you want in your game is for the player to think and act, and not have to care about how they make the game act. And so a big part of this is to maintain the illusion, not to break their mental model of what's going on. We've talked about already the idea that you don't want people to see patrolling AI, you want them to see monsters. So maintaining that sort of illusion is really, really important. To really think about the mental model you are creating for the player, think about how to maintain that, and think about how to translate their desires to action without getting in the way. And use atmosphere, use everything you've got to create that atmosphere, whether it's a computer game, whether it's a LARP. I've seen that broken in LARPs, for example, where you have a weird sound coming from a place and you see somebody in a high-vis jacket carrying a speaker around because they're a referee and you're just supposed to ignore them. And fine, as a character you can ignore them, but your player saw that, so they're not scared by that noise, not really. Whereas if you, as a player, go into a space in a live game and you hear a weird sound and you can't place where it's come from, you as a player are going to be scared by that. And that's much, much more effective. And we can use all sorts of things to do this. We can use sounds, we can use smells, which we did in God Rest You Merry. We can use visuals of all sorts. We can use music, we can use touch. Already talked about rumble, and then in live action games we've used things like vibration speakers. There are all sorts of tricks you can play, and layering that environment and making it deep and feel real and like you're just touching the edges of it. Obscuring things with darkness is always good because you don't see the detail, you don't see the edges, you just get this impression, and that's what your fight or flight brain takes, translates, and starts to see monsters in. You can do that before the game starts as well. You can do that in things like trailers. You can do it in things like your logo even. Think about the logo of something like Dragon Age. Think about the logo of something like BioShock. Looking at those games, you very quickly get an idea of the style of game you're expecting to get into. And to take this to an extreme, a great example is the film Psycho by Alfred Hitchcock. Now, he did this thing for the premiere where he sent out to everybody who was going to go to the premiere a little booklet which told you essentially how to survive watching Psycho, how to make sure they were prepared to go and see it, and the fact that they had paramedics on call in case somebody had a heart attack. Now, normally, going to see a film, you wouldn't even dream of the fact that you might have a heart attack or you might need medics, but just by his very fact of saying that stuff, it started people worrying and it started people sweating, and they were all keyed up when they sat in the cinema as to what might happen on the screen. You get very similar on things like Disney rides. There's an awful lot of effort spent on the experience of the queue itself to get you in a particular mental state by the time you actually get onto the ride. You can also do this in things like the user interface of a game or the menus of a game by making them diegetic, which means making them a part of the world rather than something layered on top. A good example is Dead Space, where the UI forms part of Isaac, the main character's suit, for example. Those indicators at the back of oxygen and health. And when you click on a deeper UI, such as things like a map, and it pops up, it's being projected from Isaac's suit, which means that he is there in character, immersed, looking at that map, and monsters might attack you from behind while you're doing it. You haven't quit out to a different screen. It's all part of the experience and part of the game and feels as if it's part of the world, and that's really useful. I'd like to tell you a little story now, an example from our game, God Rest You Merry. It is 3 a.m. You haven't slept for a couple of days and you're really not sleeping now. You're so worried about what's going on in this house. You're in bed with your partner in a first floor bedroom, a big double bed. You've got the light on because you're too scared to turn it off. You've heard weird noises. And when you came into this room, there were props and things around the place. There was a photograph of a young couple. There was a photo of a baby. There was a dried bunch of flowers from a wedding. There was a crib between the bed and the window with the name Gwendolyn hanging on it, written on a little wooden tag. And you found things around the room and around the rest of the house that refer to this couple. You know that something tragic happened here, although you don't really know the details. You found things like gambling slips, letters, deeds, estate sales. They were short of money, something odd was going on. And you'd heard things. Strange things. You've heard a couple arguing about money, but it's muffled and you've only heard it through the wall and you could never find the people. And you heard a baby crying, but you could never find the baby, and you could swear you heard a gunshot. And then in the nearby bathroom, you found some blood on the floor, but then that disappeared. Perhaps the serving staff cleaned it up. And now, 3 o'clock, you hear the baby crying again, and a shot rings out, and the door to your room bursts open. And there stands the girl from the photograph, dressed in a black dress with tears streaming down her eyes, and under one arm is a bundle, the baby, you can hear it crying, and in her other hand there is a revolver, and she runs into the room, looking backwards over her shoulder at the pursuers. But you can't see any pursuers, but she clearly can. And she runs up past you towards the window, waving the gun past you as she does so, not seeming to see you, but you're huddled there under the covers, and this gun, which you've just heard fired, is in your face. And by the time you've summoned up your courage, she's at the window. She's opened the window and she throws the baby out. Now, at that moment, as a player, if you can pull yourself together, you realise, of course, this can't be real. It's obviously an actor and the baby must be a fake. It's not a real baby. Nobody would have thrown a real baby out of the window. Surely this is just a trick. And then the woman jumps out of the window as well. And by the time you get to the window to look down, 2 stories up, there's nothing on the ground below, just stones. There's no baby, no woman, nothing there. So this is a stunt that we pulled at God Rest You Merry. And there are a lot of little psychological tricks and things going on here. Mainly, this was carried out by Kira, our stunt woman, who wanted to jump out of a window. So we tried to figure out what that stunt might be. So after talking to the stunt team, we needed to figure out how we were going to make this stunt work. And one of the things they were concerned about is that the players would get out of bed and try and tackle Kira to the ground as she tried to jump out of the window. So we needed to put the players in a certain state of mind. Now, one of the things we looked at is just a physical barrier. We thought, what can we put between the bed and the window to stop them getting there in time? Oh, there's a cot in another room. Why don't we take that and maybe nail it to the floor or something? Okay, fantastic. So they probably had a kid, right? And we came up with the idea, that stupid gag, of throwing the baby out to horrify people as a double blind first, before the woman jumped out of the window. But no, said the stunt team, because they've seen a baby now in the woman's arms. Surely they're going to rush to try and help now. They're even more engaged. So that's where we came up with the idea of the revolver. A realistic revolver waved in front of your face that you have just heard fired. And all of these little things that we're doing all add up. We get them into a particular state of mind beforehand. They know it's a ghost because they've seen all the previous material about this young woman and how disturbed she was. We've taken away some of their choices. We've shut them down and weighted the odds so that they don't get involved. And importantly, they think it's their fault that they don't get involved. They don't think it's by design. They think, if only I had acted, if only I'd tried to do something. But we have done a lot of work to try and make sure that they don't. And it may have gone wrong. Absolutely may have gone wrong. But we knew the people who were sleeping in that room, and we were relatively certain how they were going to react to what we did. And that's a really important principle underlying that, which is to put yourself in the shoes of the player, work out what they want to do at every given point. And I'm sure you've come across games where you want to do something at a particular point and the game just won't support you doing that. Well, one solution is obviously to support that action that they want to do, if you think they're going to want to do it, but that can lead to a lot of complexity. And another way is to find ways to make them not want to take that action. How can we shut it down? How can we make it feel like it's their choice to go on a particular route without them feeling guided, railroaded? And this is a really good general rule for games writing and games design of all sorts, is to put yourself in the shoes of the player. Imagine you are them. What do you want to do? How are you going to feel? How can you tweak that? The way that they feel and the way that they react, and how can you make good guesses as to that? So we've already talked a little about this, but this concept that you should scare the player, not the character. A good example of this is Indiana Jones and his fear of snakes. If we watch a movie or play a computer game where Indiana Jones has come up against a snake pit, I, as a player, can logically completely understand why he doesn't want to cross that snake pit, because I know he's scared of snakes. But maybe I'm not scared of snakes. I can empathise with him and I can understand him, but I don't necessarily feel the fear. However, if it was about heights, then absolutely I would feel the fear because I'm scared of heights. We can't rely on everybody not liking heights. We can't rely on everybody not liking snakes. And that means that from a horror perspective, we have to try and think of a set of things which will affect the broadest range of players, or put in a large variety of things. Addressing primal fears is a way to look at that, the base fears that most people will have. It's also the reason why Spielberg is so successful, and I'm not talking about horror now. If you look at Spielberg movies, almost all of them have something in them which is about family and about family bonds, and those are things that we can all relate to. Even if we didn't have tight family bonds, we can understand the desire for them, we can see them in action, and the themes that he addresses are really strong and appeal to a wide range of people, and so his movies do as well. And I said before that not all of this is about jump scares. It's not all about that primal moment where your brain takes over and acts. One of the design things that we tried to do in Soma particularly is make the horror more about what you think of as you've put the game controller down and you're lying in bed at night. We're trying to disturb you on a much deeper level and provoke existential thoughts about things that will haunt you for quite some time. And when you're pulling people into your game world, it's worthwhile thinking about how to get them into a certain mental state. I've talked about this a little bit already, but if we can push them off balance and make them uncertain about how the world works, then that's great. There are brilliant examples of this from computer games. Metal Gear Solid on the PlayStation, there is a moment where the main boss you're up against, Psycho Mantis, talks directly to you as a player, and you think, oh yeah, it's just another cutscene, it's just something written. And then they start talking about the particular games that you have played, because the developers read the cartridge at the time with your save games to figure out what you had been doing, so they could make Psycho Mantis actually talk directly to you about the things you had done, which was really, really unusual at that point, and suddenly blows your mind. Another good example is an information security play that I helped with a few years back in London. The idea there was that there was a scene with a hacker with lots of visual displays that you expect, things projected all over the walls, and gradually, some people in the audience started to realise that they recognised some of the pictures on the walls, and that these were personal photographs of perhaps the house they lived in, or somebody that they really liked, or something like this. And it's a really easy thing to do in this day and age, because as soon as you have somebody's email address, for example, if they buy a ticket and they haven't read the small print very carefully, you can mine things like their Facebook feeds for photographs or Instagram, and figure out details that they'll recognise and will affect them directly. And suddenly this world of the play, this story, is affecting them. And you only need to affect a few people in the audience for them to have a reaction which will ripple around the rest of the room. For God Rest You Merry, we very carefully set up how the players got into our world. We welcomed them all at the little lodge just down the road from the main house itself. They were obviously their 21st century selves. We took them into the house, they could get changed into the right costume. There was music playing in the lodge, fairly unnoticeably, but a low-level, deep, dark notes from horror films and horror games, just to set them a little bit off edge. I took them into a room, each one, ostensibly to talk with them, to make sure they were happy with the rules, and then I asked them to draw a tarot card from a deck of Arthurian tarot, and I looked at each card and wrote the card on a piece of paper, and then I asked them to close their eyes, and I took a photograph of them. Thank you very much, I said, and let them go. There was no reason for the photograph. There was no reason for the Arthurian tarot card, but they didn't know that. And just with that off-balanceness that came of, well, why have they taken a photograph of me? How is that going to come back in the game? How is it going to affect me? I had players afterwards saying that they thought they might find their own body in a morgue, for example. You're just undermining their sense of reality and their sense of the rules, and making them start to ask why. And then the fiction was something like, there's been flooding, so we can't drive you up to the lodge in your car, you'll have to walk through the darkness. So we set them off in the dark, in little groups with a little lantern towards the ancient manor house, and they went through the forest, which was a little bit foggy, of course, because that's how horror games work, but also because our special effects department were making it a little bit foggy, and they set off without being able to see anything, and eventually met a butler who took them down into the house itself and took them into the main room of the house. And unfortunately, there was a power cut. The whole place was dark. I say unfortunately, but of course we'd arranged the whole thing. But the whole house was dark, apart from the parlour, and they all went into the parlour, and it was actually quite Christmassy. There was a fire going. They'd prepared some punch. There were candles. There was Christmas scent in the air. They'd left their baggage in the hallway, and they went in and they started to talk to people and felt perhaps a little bit safer. And then after a while, a servant would come up to someone and tap on their shoulder and say, "Excuse me, sir, your room is ready. We've taken your bags up for you. Shall I show you the way?" And the servant with a candle would lead them up into a maze of corridors, taking them by the longest way they possibly could to their bedroom, just with a little candle, no other light. And in their bedroom, they would leave them with the candle. And they'd be in their bedroom alone in the dark. And they'd start to examine it to find out what's there. You open the drawers, you open the cupboards, you find some of the things we talked about earlier, photos, relics of people who've been here before, mementos of all sorts. And you find that somebody has unpacked your luggage and put it into all the drawers. And that's nice. It works on a bunch of levels. It works, for example, on the fact that this is a 1950s game. The idea that somebody takes your luggage and unpacks it for you suddenly throws you into a particular mindset of game. Secondly, if you remember, our players have brought with them those packs about the character, which are letters and photographs and potential blackmail material. And suddenly the players are starting to worry about the blackmail material which might have been found. So you've got them worried about social things. You've got them worried about being alone in the dark with a candle. You've got them worried about what's going to happen next. And their brains are doing the work for you now. And the old house is doing the work for you now. You don't need monsters at this point. You can leave them, as we did, for hours just with the creaks and groans of the house, just with the weird props we'd left in weird places, with the strange behaviour of the servants, and with the anticipation building. And if you can get them into that headspace, the horror becomes easy. Fundamentally, what we're trying to do with all of these things is to give people stories to tell. We call them war stories, the idea that you're sitting in a bar with your friends and you're telling them about the thing that happened to you, the moment when the girl jumped out of the window, the moment when the man in front of you burst into flames, the moment when you saw a ghost hovering in the air along the corridor. If you can make these memories for them, and you can make these memories unique to them ideally, or to a small group of them, they'll always tell them to other people, and they will embellish those stories, and those stories will grow, and they will always remember them. And the connecting material between those moments, you can make that as high quality as you like, but if you don't have those moments, the event will be forgettable, or the film will be forgettable, or the game will be forgettable. You need to have these peaks that people will always remember. And to do this, well, we use every trick we can in the book. In something like Soma, it's all the departments. It's sound design, art, animation, design, programming, voice acting, writing, music. All of it works together to create any given moment. You are pulling from every department you can, and all those departments will collaborate together to do that. Same with God Rest You Merry. Sound design, costume, art, video, music, game design, PR, stunts, writing, publishing, electronics, programming, stage magic, custom smells, VR, improvisational theatre, all of that stuff working together to achieve an effect. And the way to do that is to figure out first what the effect is you're trying to achieve, and then make sure that everybody understands that, so that your whole team is collaborating to heighten that effect, because every team, every person, every department you collaborate with will make that better and make that stick better. And fundamentally what we're doing is using the player's imagination. And that's the most important thing, whether you're creating horror, fantasy, love stories, whatever it is. Rely on the most powerful processor that we have access to, which is the human brain. And remember that you're not trying to put this stuff in your game, in your production. You're trying to put this stuff into the player's head. That's it. Thank you very much. Sorry if I waffled on too long there. I'm Ian. I write about a bunch of this stuff. You can find it on wildwinter.medium.com, and feel free to drop me an email or write to me on Twitter. I'm happy to discuss any of these things, probably for way too long. Have a good convention.